Now I crinkled my paper all up.
Yeah, we're all good. Welcome to the Hackaday podcast. My name's Mike Szczys. I'm editor-in-chief of Hackaday.
And I'm Tom Nardi, contributing editor.
This is episode 135. Today we're talking about 3 rocket hacks, all the Game Boy gates, and depth sounding from a rowboat. Elliot is off this week, and I'm so glad that you joined us, Tom, because we have to talk about this Astra rocket launch.
It was definitely a unique one, right?
Yeah, so for our listeners, this happened like while we were recording last week's episode, so we missed it, but it was at the beginning of last week, and well, you wrote the article, Tom. Tell us what happened.
So this is it was their third attempt to get to space. The previous ones didn't get there. Let's just say that. But you know, they learned from the mistakes, and they were pretty confident in this one. And it seemed like it was gonna go well, except, you know, a second or two after it left the launch pad, one of the engines actually exploded, and that created sort of an offset thrust. And as luck would have it, it made the rocket crab walk sideways away from the launch pad and all the ground support stuff, and then it flew laterally for a while until it had burned enough propellant that it became light enough that the engines had enough thrust to carry it up. And surprisingly, it recovered, and it went, there was a line on the live chat where it said, approaching nominal trajectory. It was actually working its way back towards the flight plan that it had, but with one engine down, it never had enough thrust to, hit the milestones they needed in terms of like speed and that sort of thing. So they made a decision to abort, which is, a destructive, abort. It blows the whole rocket up, basically. You got to give them credit for designing the guidance system on this vehicle that was able to, on one hand, balance, kind of sound like a rocket powered Segway, that it could stay vertical while moving, sideways, but then actually, recover for the most part. And, I understand the logistics for terminating it once it, deviates from the flight path, but I think everybody was curious to see how far would it have gotten if they just kind of let it roll. But, there's always a risk, of it going, sideways and endangering somebody, so they couldn't really take that chance. But
having burned a bunch of fuel just hovering there, I think. But it's really a lot of luck here. You're right, a great design, the fact that it was able to do this. But if it had teetered the other direction and like rammed into the support tower, that would have been it, right?
Oh, it would have, yeah. And actually, one of I think it was their last launch. The rocket blew up right over the launch pad, and it rained debris and all this stuff, and it knocked them out of running for a while because they had to do a lot of repairs. Very timely, costly stuff. So they're very lucky that didn't happen, because now the launch pad was totally fine, and my understanding is they plan on flying again pretty soon. Like they were working on the next rocket when this one went, so there won't be any downtime.
You mentioned their stock price like dropped when the market's open again, but really. So the launch didn't go as planned, but they weren't put out of commission for a long period of time because it went kind of okay.
Yeah, there wouldn't be a way for it to go better and still fail. I think, they got a lot of information. It flew far enough away that they didn't, endanger anybody. There no facilities. Obviously getting to space was right. That was the goal, and there were payloads on this one. I think actually Space Force had some research or something on it. So that's always a bummer when that doesn't make it. But if it's got to go wrong, this is the way you want it to. Far away, over the ocean. They don't have to do any. I think there was like a toxic cleanup they had to do it the last time because all that fuel fell on the land, so they had to pull up all the soil, and it was a nightmare.
This is a journey into sound.
What's that sound?
What's that sound?
So Elliot might not be here this week, Tom, but he left us a "What's that sound?" I don't know what it is. He didn't tell you, right?
No, it's interesting. I was curious if we had to come up with something on our own, or if he was going to
Nope.
impart us with wisdom.
We've got it. So let's let it roll, and then we'll see if the two of us can guess it. What's your guess on this, Tom?
I mean, I guess a game, but that's not really saying much, right?
Yeah, I'd guess a game. It sounds like pan flute, right?
I want to say some like old school LucasArts game.
I was thinking like Tomb Raider.
Maybe? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but it does sound like some Ewok music, doesn't it? So if you are screaming at the podcast device, the car stereo, whatever you're listening to this on right now, and you know what this is, head over to hackaday.com/podcast. You will see a link there to a Google form where you can put in your name that you want to be called on air, the email address so that we can email you, and your answer to this. We will randomly draw one person who answered correctly to win a very limited edition Hackaday podcast shirt. Let's get into our hacks, Tom. The first one that I have this week is a mind-blowing recreation of the Nintendo Game Boy chip, which is the DMG01 chip. Austin Appleby made a gate-by-gate recreation of this. Now, when I hear gate-by-gate, I think that it's going to be like hardware design language, something you could like run on an FPGA. And we'll get to that. It's not. This is actually running in an emulation. But the code has been written to replicate all of the gates in the chip, and there's a lot of gates in there. In this case, it's everything except for the audio section of it, because there's some real-time stuff going on in there, and I don't know, probably some analog stuff going on in there as well. And then the CPU is kind of a best guess of what the CPU is doing, because this is being recreated from microscopic images of the die itself, and it was difficult to see the CPU on the die shot.
Yeah, I mean, it is amazing. I think this is one of those ones that you really got to look into it, because at first glance you might just think, okay, we got plenty of emulators. You can emulate Game Boy on anything anymore. I mean, in a web browser now, right? But this is really a whole other level, and it's kind of the polar opposite of most emulators. I don't know that people necessarily realize that most emulators make a lot of educated guesses and a lot of tricks to make the game playable, but they're not necessarily accurate. So this is the total opposite. It's super accurate but not necessarily playable, because he says even on a high-end machine you get like 8 frames per second and no audio. Right. So it's more of just a challenge thing, but somewhere in the middle ground is what we're more used to.
And I had not seen before this resource that he's working from, which is Furtek put together a repo on GitHub called DMG CPU Inside that has die shots of the CPU and then schematics that are drawn out manually from the structures on the die. And so Austin started from this great resource and then went through and started assigning like a code to each kind of like data cell. So he's able to give like a 4-letter designation for the type of cell made up of different gates, like what it does. And then from there added like the page of the Furtek schematic that it went to, and then traced all of them out to make sure that they're actually right. And the process found some errors that Furtek had, which obviously you're going to have errors when you're doing this sort of thing, and then put a hash mark beside each of these blocks. And the crazy thing, Tom, did you look at where he has like the zoomed in on like one of these cells, and then the next image is the entire die shot, and there's like this tiny little red dot, and he's like, there's that cell
with the little "you are here" dot. Yeah, you don't realize until he pulls back, and even says, to give you an idea of scale, and there's this tiny little section of this huge map that we've been talking about this whole up to that point. It's really to talk about labor of love.
Yeah, and he goes, I retraced a bunch of the cells and was able to work out definitively what they did via a sort of logic Sudoku. That was in the comments of the article.
And it kind of goes on too, because there's like a little FAQ, and one of the things is this a perfect recreation? And he's like, no, because there's, even with all the work and all the effort, I mean, there's still, he said, there's like environmental issues, like the temperature of the chip and like the battery level and stuff, that they introduce little glitches that, even though all the gates are
Right.
accurately recreated, there's real world phenomena that isn't being taken into account. So you can't really say it's a perfect emulation, but I mean, it's obviously way closer than anything that you're used to just running on your phone.
Right, and I mean that's kind of like the old adage that like there is no digital electronics, everything is analog, and like when you get down to it, you see that. And then the thing that I always think about is propagation. So if you're trying to get something to run really quickly, the distance between the output of one gate and the input of another matters. Like how fast the electron can travel through the copper or whatever the metal in the chip is. When I was looking at this, though, it's a wonderful read, and I spent way too, as we do, right, Tom? Like I'm trying to get work done, and I get to this, and all of a sudden I'm like, well, I guess I'm not getting anything else done today.
there goes that day.
But it's a good read, and it made me think of NAND to Tetris. Have you ever encountered this one, Tom?
No, you put that in the notes, and actually that was the first time I had seen that one.
So I loved this. So it's an online course that anybody can go and take, and it goes through the fundamentals from the textbook called The Elements of Computing Systems, which is, if you did a computer science degree, this would be one of the courses texts that we go through. But in the online version, I wrote about it way back in 2012, so I'll put the link in there. But you basically start with hardware description language, and you build a NAND gate. And then you build a gate, and then you put those gates together to get a NAND gate, and then you put the NAND gates together to build an ALU, and then you connect everything together up to the point where the system that you built you can now run Tetris on. And it feels very much like that, because Austin is going through and looking at these gates, figuring out what they do, then wiring them up into code, and then running automated tests that are being borrowed from the emulation side of the hobby or the craft to validate that the parts that he's implemented are actually performing the way that you would expect them.
I really liked injection molding silicone parts for under $50 from Jan Mrazek. This is a cheap way to create silicone parts using 3D printed molds, specifically resin printed, so that there's no lines in them. And the idea is they prints the mold in sections, bolts them all together, and then uses high pressure to inject the silicone into the mold. And the advantage using the pressure is that you can force it into all the little nooks and crannies and make more complex shapes than you'd be able to do if you just pour it. The setup's a little bit more because you have to have the high pressure gun, and he talks about having to vacuum out all the bubbles and that kind of thing ahead of time. So it's not necessarily a beginner project, but it the end results are very impressive. They look very professional. I'd say if there's one downside, it's that at least me, I don't find myself in need of a lot of soft pieces. I'd like to be able to do something similar with something that would cure and be hard. But if you needed something soft, like a flexible piece, this is definitely a very quick way to do it. And once you have the equipment, you'd be able to iterate through different designs pretty rapidly.
Well, and I was confused by this at first. If you look at the picture on the top of this article, that's not just one mold, right? That's like a dozen molds all clamped together for one injection process.
Yeah, right. That was how it is a little bit weird because you think it's like some giant piece, but no, they're all like separate little molds.
I think the big potential here is to do composite pieces, right? So if you have a resin printer and you resin print out something with a handle, you could then put it inside of a mold like this, and you could injection mold silicone soft parts for the grippy part of it.
Well, right. And that kind of is interesting because that plays into a previous project that he had done. I think we covered it like a month ago, where it was very similar to this, but he would put 3D printed ribs, for lack of a better word, inside the mold ahead of time, and then would, squirt the silicone in, and then they would be almost like the skeleton, the skeleton, and then the silicone will be the fleshy part, so there would be parts with internal, elements to add, rigidity. But yeah, you could definitely do like an overmold sort of thing too. I guess you'd have to hold it centered in the mold and that kind of thing, but that's the least of your problems. Well,
I just think for rapid turn on this stuff, like if you're going to get a production run of something, it's going to cost you a boatload. And so you want to make sure like it fits my hand nicely, or it, meshes well with this other thing, or it looks funny and I need to redesign that, or, a million different questions that you could answer, all for the cost of like just running another mold off on your goo printer.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. We've always said, that was kind of the strength of 3D printers. Like the actual print to piece in production is, too time consuming, but you can make, customize things. And then if you start doing molds and you can pump them out, with a more mass production friendly technique, it's really pretty amazing what you can do in home, totally in-house production now.
What's the deal with this, the gun that he has for injecting the silicone?
Yes, I thought it was at first just like a caulk gun kind of thing, but it's definitely some kind of pneumatic. It's referred to as a silicone delivery air gun, which seems very technical. And it even gives you the pressure, like in kilopascals, like how much to pump it up. It does. It looks like a caulk gun, maybe even like a cake thing. But then if you notice on the bottom, it's got like the quick connect for the compressor. So, it is pneumatic. It's not like you just squeeze it.
There's like a whole world of pneumatic tools that I'm just totally missing it. Like I don't even own a compressor. I have a friend who has a compressor, and I bought a little finish nailer that I just gave to him. And then every time I need to do like baseboards in my house, I'm like, hey, can I borrow that compressor from you?
Get that compressor.
But I think I could have a ton of fun with it if I had one in my shop.
Yeah. If you go into the article, he mentions it's $23 for this gun. So it's not exactly. That's awesome. You do need a compressor. I think somebody in the comments was like, "Well, I need a compressor." Like, okay, guy, you need a compressor, but like, but at least the gun's $23. That's hardly breaking the bank. And he does mention there are electric ones too, like a lead screw kind of deal. But those are more expensive, and I would imagine slower too. Yeah. So if you have the compressor, this is definitely the way to go.
Well, Tom, one of the things I've always wanted to be able to just whip up from my workbench is custom OLEDs.
As one does, right?
This stuff is definitely black magic, but it doesn't look that way when your room Vlogar does it. And that's because he spent a good chunk of his career working at Philips developing organic LED displays. But it is really awesome to watch him work through this in a matter-of-fact way. And he has 2 different displays that he built up. One of them is a 7-segment display where each of the segments works really nicely, glowing in green on a glass slide. And then the other one is just like a slide that you would shine light through, except for the lettering actually lights up because it is the organic LED itself.
This was really a phenomenal watch. I know I don't think I'm alone that I get kind of leery about like these long YouTube videos. A lot of them are kind of just fluff, but this one was 20 minutes of rapt attention. Like everything in it was really cool. All the equipment, he said he worked at Philips, so this is not somebody who's just banging rocks together and hoping for the best. Like he knows exactly what to do, and you could tell with the equipment and the procedure. And the end results are phenomenal. Like when I saw the little picture on the top, I almost thought, is this like a Photoshop or something? Like, is this just, one of like clickbait pictures to get you in there? Because it looks so perfect, especially the one that says like making OLEDs. But then now you watch the video and it's real, and it is in the end not perfect, and that's kind of, I guess, the downside is that because they're not sealed and they're exposed to the elements, they break down very quickly. And I think in the video he says within a few minutes at a microscopic level you can actually see the oxidation, and then like after a couple hours, like even to the naked eye, you're like, okay, this is it's burning out, for lack of a better word. It's really like the material falling apart.
Right. And the first 10 minutes of the video is him just talking about all that theory, right? So he talks about like a 5-layer stack up of deposited films on top of the glass. And then, where those actually line up and where they're missing is what forms the way that the thing works. But if the cathode is exposed to open atmosphere that has, water molecules and oxygen molecules in it, you start to have like an oxidation layer that builds up, and then it prevents the electrons from traveling through like they should in order to create the photons.
Right, and it sounded like if you have a clean enough environment, you can kind of avoid some of that too, because it's stuff falling on there. And I've often heard, even in real production, like not in someone's basement, that OLEDs have a very high like failure rate. So that's why it's been hard to get big OLEDs, because if you do a 50-inch TV, there's a very high likelihood that there's going to be problems with it, because it is very fickle.
Oh man, and I looked at that, and it's like it can be an order of magnitude difference between like an LCD TV and the same size OLED TV.
Oh yeah. So I think we're just kind of really starting to see it in phones are starting to do more OLED, and that's only 6 inches or whatever.
Right.
So it's taken a while.
Man, I have one of those though, and they're so worth it. Like they look so good on the phone, and I think that small screen with the high pixel density is the perfect application for it too.
Yeah, and this project, even if you're not interested in making one yourself or have the equipment, I think it is a really good look at just how OLEDs function too, from somebody who really knows. So I thought it was fascinating just to, I can't say that before this I really knew like all the layers of like the OLED stack up. I kind of had an idea, but he steps you through it, and it helps that he's making it in real time. But even if you just look at the explanation, it's just, I always like to see someone who really knows what they're talking about explaining something, and this was a perfect example of that.
Yeah, and he's buying pre-sensitized glass slides that have the photoresist on them, and then the cool tip is using a resin printer to expose the photoresist. And so what that is like the resin printer has a UV screen basically underneath the resin tank that it shines up into. And so he just makes whatever he wants to mask, and then makes it like as a 3D object so that the lights stay on for multiple layers, gets rid of the resin part of the tank, and just sets these slides on top of the light source.
Yeah, I thought that was cool. And he's got like a little jig or something on there, so like it makes sure it's sitting perfectly square over the screen. I think we saw something similar they did for PCBs too. They were
on resin printers.
Yeah, using a resin printer. But I think that one they actually did have the tank was in there, and they were depositing like a layer of the UV resin on the copper board. So this was kind of an interesting approach, using a pre-sensitized thing. I wonder if the same technique actually could be used for PCBs. That's interesting.
Oh, that'd be worth a try. I don't see why not. So Jeroen does put the sensitized, or after he does the etching, he puts it under the microscope, and he's lamenting about the jaggy edges at a microscopic level. But that's just because he was doing this in industry. Like if anybody else who was doing this at home would be like, it's so amazingly clean, when they saw the same image under the microscope. Yeah,
I think the kids call that like a humble brag. Like he was looking under the microscope and he's like, oh, look at these microscopic little ledges. I was like, come on. Like, it looks perfect,
Yeah, on the other hand, we just saw Sam Zalouf doing photoresist for silicon fabrication, and what he's doing is he's taking the light source and then running it backwards through a microscope, and so the lens is shrinking it down, and so then what you have is your resolution, each pixel of your resolution is getting made even smaller. So like there are definitely hacker ways that you could make this have smoother edges, but honestly I think your biggest problem is going to be how to seal them so they don't oxidize and stop working.
Yeah, and he said that that was the big tricky part especially for a DIY thing, because it has to be either glass or metal and totally encapsulated, which naturally adds a whole new dimension of hassle to the production. Yeah, that was very cool. I was glad one of us picked that one.
I feel like I got all the really technical ones. I'm like, oh, Tom's gonna be mad at me because I took all the deep dives.
Speaking of deep dives, I have a confession to make. I am terrified by deep water, but at the same time, I'm fascinated by it. So that kind of drew me to Naomi's project, which is a homebrew. I guess you could say like an attempt to crowdsource accurate depth measurements for water. You can get charts naturally, but the charts you get from the government, they're for the busy waterways and the channels and stuff, and the little more inland stuff, the rivers and the creeks, they often don't get nearly the attention that they deserve. So this setup was an attempt to use an off-the-shelf depth finder to hook that into the information from a GPS and actually be able to map the bottom. It looks like a little dock kind of marina area that he's running here, and the results are really impressive. Like the information goes through a couple Python scripts, and you get this very professional looking like heat map that shows the water depth. And the one thing I did look into, I actually might send him a message. I'd love to know what depth finder he is using, because it has like a NEMA output, like a GPS. Every second, it just drops that the depth on the line, so you could pull it in. And as soon as I saw this project, I immediately went online and I was like, "Can I find one of these?" Because I would be interested in sort of recreating it, and I can't find one that has that feature. So I'm a little curious if there's like a model number or something that he'd be willing to include in there. And I think for the record, for anyone who's listening, this is not like some complicated sonar that like shows you like the contours of the bottom of the water or anything. It's literally like a little dash mounted thing, and it just shows a number, in meters or feet, whatever, just hit the units. So it's super simple. It'll say 4, 5, 6. Like there's no graphical thing, but that number is then just being outputted, and you can combine that with a separate GPS feed to create the maps.
Yeah, it is fascinating to think of it that way, because I always, you see like those fish finders that
Right.
will show you like different stuff on the screen, and like what would you do with that? So as long as you have a way of getting just the number data out, it should be really easy
Right.
to capture
Like
this along the
instantaneous.
way. Yeah, and I mean that's the hard part. So I shouldn't say that's the hard part, because he's actually on a waterway that has tidal change. And so he mentions he actually has to like juke the numbers based on the time that they came in, because the water would have risen. I don't know if you can't probably use GPS alone for that, but there's that high quality GPS that uses both GPS and a base station. You might be able to get like a precise height above the base station fixed point if you really wanted to go crazy with this. But I'd say looking at the depth map, he's really achieved what he was trying to do here.
Yeah. I mean, it's very impressive, and we always say that we get as many tips, I think, from the comments that as we do in the tips line. And somebody in the comments links to opencmap.org, which apparently is a community of people doing exactly this kind of thing. They're making their own crowdsourced depth maps of bodies of water that aren't necessarily getting attention from the mapping organizations worldwide, but they don't have the bandwidth to map all these little inland water channels.
Well, onto something completely different. We have a video game controller that you can sit on, which is kind of my favorite type of if you think about driving games, you can have like the steering wheel on your desk and even get some pedals. But yeah, that's only like marginally better than just using a traditional gaming joystick. Well, the Q wasn't having any of it and wanted to have a motorcycle gaming controller that it was somewhat like they are at the arcade. And so pulled out the welder and just whipped up a motorcycle seat and handlebars that I've seen people complaining that it looks a little bit more like a mountain bike, but I say to each their own. I really liked on this one, Tom, how it is not like directly using its own sensors. Instead, it has kind of like a pulley and string system in order to move the sticks and the triggers on an Xbox controller.
Yeah, it reminded me of the 3D printed like flexure.
Oh yeah,
Joysticks we covered recently, where the controller just snaps into it and it moves all the sticks and the buttons. I was surprised by that. I almost feel like that's harder than just making like a USB human interface device. Because I'm pretty sure all the new consoles will just accept like a generic game controller. But it certainly looks cool seeing all the linkages move move the sticks, and even like the shoulder buttons. It's using like I guess real like maybe not motorcycle, like mountain bike brakes. So he actually has like the cable that is pulling it back. So that's cool to interface with like the real hardware.
Yeah. Now, have you ridden a motorcycle?
I have not.
I have not ridden a motorcycle.
Big surprise.
I've not ever thought to myself, riding a motorcycle would be a good thing, but there are people who do, and luckily they jumped into the comments on this one to let us know that this is not how you steer a motorcycle, which is completely foreign to me.
Right.
Once you have a motorcycle up to speed, the wheels both become gyroscopes. And so because of the gyroscopic effect, you apparently counter steer a motorcycle. So if you want to go left on a motorcycle, you push the left side of the handlebars forward, which is counterintuitive.
Yeah, it is. And I almost feel like it's an elaborate prank to get me to fall on a motorcycle, because I can't even wrap my mind around thinking about it here. No, you'll fall. But I think probably only a very minute motion of the handlebar, right? Like that's got to be the key.
Yeah. So this is, but it doesn't make a lot of sense to me the videos I've seen of beginners having a bad time on motorcycles.
I've seen many videos of people falling on motorcycles.
Yeah,
that is actually probably most of my information comes from fail videos on YouTube.
Right. I looked up the counter steering, and I found this website, and it says if the wheel is turned to the left, the top will twist to the right, pushing the bottom to the left.
If they say so.
I think maybe I picked out the wrong thing to read. You may have to go and read this one for yourself. But if you think about that physics experiment where they take a bicycle wheel, and usually I think it's filled, instead of with air, they fill it with concrete even. And then hold two handles where the axle of the wheel is, and then they spin it up really fast, like using a motor. And then you sit on a swiveling office chair. And when you tilt it so that the top of the wheel goes left or right, it will then turn you on that chair automatically left or right. And it's this gyroscopic effect that makes the motorcycle steer in that direction. And it just happens to be the wrong way on the handlebars, then tilt the motorcycle because of the gyroscopic action. And that tilt, like if the motorcycle tilts to left, it's going to go left. So when you push the left side of the handlebars away from you, the top of the wheel is going to tilt left, and the motorcycle is going to go left.
All right. I guess.
All right. This could be an award for our the worst radio show description of the year on how to steer a motorcycle.
Yeah. Well, I'm fairly sure I will never have to put it into practice. So it's an interesting, like, academic thing, but the chances of me getting on a motorcycle. I mean, somebody in the comments did say, like, what's the cutoff? Because, like, how fast do you have to be going? Because, does this happen when you're on a bike? And I'm pretty sure it doesn't. Like when you're riding a regular bike, I turn right to go right. So I guess there must be a weight and speed component that at some point the steering reverses.
Yeah, from reading a bunch of sites on this, because again, I'm not going to test it out in practice. It's kind of like when a motorboat reaches plane, and then it like goes a little bit better. Like there's a point at which the motorcycle is like self-balancing, basically.
Right.
It finds its groove, and once it's in the groove, then you better steer backwards.
Yeah, there's nothing I like more than a vehicle that changes its controls while you're operating it. Well, we already talked about one rocket that took the long way around to get to space. So that leads me into the next hack I liked, which is the 3-stage thrust vectoring model rocket that was created by BPS Space. We've looked at a lot of the other model rockets they've done over the years, and the kind of continuing goal is to recreate what is being done in like the commercial space stuff, SpaceX and all that, but on a much smaller scale, and obviously with hobbyist components, and that's included landing on the rocket's tail and all that. But in this one, the focus is really on guidance on the way up, and that includes building the flight computers, which usually are fairly big and elaborate and take up a lot of space inside this small model rocket. The hook for this one is that they've distilled all of that experience and knowledge that they've had from the previous flight computers and made something that's the size of your thumbnail. It basically just has a microcontroller, an IMU to sense the motion of the rocket, and then using the available GPIO pins will control servos and the igniter for the motor. It's as bare bones as it gets, but in the video, if you ignore the other issues that come up with flying model rockets, the computers themselves work really well, and it's an excellent design that you could definitely adapt to any sort of small, lightweight flying machine that you wanted to guide on a preset course.
I do think that once you get to the point where you have so few components on such a small board, then it makes sense to be able to, it's kind of like the CAN bus on an automobile where you have a tiny microcontroller in like every possible thing. Like making all of this stuff modular means that you have these parts and then you can kind of like mix and match on your next rocket build.
Oh yeah, I'm sure we're going to see this little module pop up in the future. One thing that was also, wasn't about the computer itself, but on the third stage they actually had like reaction wheels that they were going to try to which was very, very ambitious. I don't think they did anything. I don't know that the third stage even ever fired. It seemed like just getting the first two to go off in order was enough of a challenge. But that's very cool. I'd like to see more of that. And it's using the same controller instead of spinning the servos, it's just spinning a motor with like a little 3D printed wheel. And you actually see in the video this little like weights on the wheel to give it some mass. So that was really cool.
I'm used to reaction wheels used in like small satellites for low gravity, orientation changes. Like, are they often used in rockets as well? No. I don't think there's any. I mean, maybe like a sounding rocket or something, but a real rocket is too big for that kind of thing. They just have to gimbal the motors. And for this one, it looked like they were just trying to do roll control. So in the video, he said basically you spin the motor one way, you roll it. The rocket is supposed to spin the other way. And then by controlling the speed, in theory, you could cancel out if you started rolling. Like I said, it doesn't seem like it actually was effective in this video, but hopefully it's something they'll be able to put into practice later on. First up on my list of quick hacks today is Danny Huyn, who is building, I just have such a special place in my heart for like really accurate models. And these are really accurate models if you lived in the post-apocalyptic world. And so that's why when Danny Conradi wrote this one, he used the title Small Scale Mad Max. If you are having a bad day, you need to look through these. There's a ton of videos that go through and show all of the different amazing creations that Danny has come up with. Next up on my list, 3D printed synth kit shares product design insights. This was a little keyboard by Tommy. I really cued into it because you get to see the guts of this, and as with a lot of consumer electronics, it's a pretty small circuit board. It does have discrete momentary push buttons on it for each of the keys on the keyboard, but the enclosure is 3D printed in such a way that then you get a little mini keyboard with about, 14 keys on the top of it, and it looks like you just bought this at the toy store, and it sounds like you bought it at the professional audio equipment store. And finally, Teeny ESP32 Strider walks the walk. This is a project by Chen Liang. It is not a strand beast because the geometry of the legs is different, and this one actually walks a little bit more efficiently. But if you've seen a strand beast with the multiple legs that kind of have a rolling motion that propel the robot forward, this is along the same lines. A ton of 3D printed parts. It's fun to see those go together, but only 2 gearhead motors that do it, and all run by an ESP32 cam. The thing is a delight to walk around the house, and I think anyone that sees this is going to want one for themselves.
My first quick hack is quiet on the set goes for objects too. This is a really interesting video about how Tim Schultz makes props for film and TV. You can't have billiard balls clacking and ice cubes tinkling in glasses when you're trying to record dialogue. So the idea is to make lookalikes that are completely silent, and that usually makes they're made out of rubber or something else like that. This doesn't have the kind of how-to detail that we might be used to as Hackaday readers, but it is very illuminating, and it's definitely worth a watch. Next up is building a levitating turbine desk toy. This one is, the classic little spinning desk toy that you've probably seen in the gift shop, except it's all 3D printed and uses magnets. The hook here is that because the central levitating piece is 3D printed, you can actually put little fin designs into it and experiment with different ways of catching the wind and that sort of thing. So it's cool to look at and has a little bit of a practical experimenting angle to it. And finally, I have lightning detector keeps a tally. This one comes from the level 1 hackerspace, and we've seen plenty of lightning detectors before. What I like about this one, though, is it uses a NeoPixel ring to kind of flash along with the lightning, and when there's nothing going on, the display doubles as a clock that also uses a binary representation to show how many lightning strikes it's seen in the past.
It's time for our Can't Miss Articles of the Week. This is long-form content written by excellent Hackaday authors, and I've picked one this week by Eric Evenchik called The Post-Mortem Password Problem. And Tom, this is something I think we all kind of have had in mind at some point. I've got a lot of passwords, and they're all for me written down somewhere, but I'm the only one that has the password to where they're written down. Right, so if I get hit by a bus tomorrow, nobody gets into any of my accounts. Is that a problem?
I think it's a problem. I think it's a problem. And I think every year it becomes more of a problem as we become, increasingly reliant on online everything.
Yeah, and it's really kind of antithetical to the password problem because you need to design a system that will grant someone access to all your passwords without you needing to okay it.
Right.
How do you do that? So Eric kind of goes into the problem and he talks about using password keepers is something that we should all be doing. And so then if you've decided, okay, I'm going to use a password keeper, this is like digital storage for your passwords that has a password to decrypt all those passwords. So if someone gets to your password safe, they can't actually get anything unless they get the password to the password safe. And so if you're using like a hosted option like LastPass or 1Password, or he's got a bunch of others listed here, there will be a master password when you log into the website. If you're using one of your own, like I like to use KeePassX, which is a Linux password keeper that keeps your vault locally. Again, they're going to need a password on there. But in this case, I didn't realize those hosted services actually have some options to get into them. Like I went up and looked at the LastPass that Eric talks about, and there is a recovery option where like I could put my wife as like she would sign up for an account on LastPass. I could indicate her account as an emergency access thing, and then you set an amount of time, like 3 hours, 3 days, 3 weeks, something like that. And if she requests access, it's going to then ask me, and I have whatever that time period is to deny access to those people. But if you're incapacitated for some reason, you just have to let that timeout go, and then the person with emergency access will be able to get to your passwords.
Yeah, it's like the classic dead man switch, like if you don't do whatever the action is in a certain amount of time, it figures, well, he must be out of action. Somebody in the comments even mentioned that Google has apparently a similar thing for your account, which I wasn't aware of until this. I got to say, I have probably terrible password habits. I don't use the same one on all of them, and I'll say that. And it's not my luggage password or anything either. But I don't use like a password keeper. I have it all in my head, which is the absolute worst scenario, because if anything happens, like there's literally no there's no chance of anybody getting in. And
right.
It's, I can't tell you the last time I physically went to a bank. Like everything is online. So it is a process. And reading this, it kind of did make me realize, I got kids and stuff. I can't be as cavalier about this as I maybe was in my youth, and I should set up something like this. I will say I kind of agree with some of the commenters, though, that as interesting as these high tech solutions are, probably just writing them down and putting them in a little book and having it in a safe is the most foolproof way for because all right, so let's say you have it on your computer, but maybe you forgot to put you can't get the computer that got the full disk encryption, something like that you didn't give that information away, so they can't get onto the computer, and it's a self-hosted thing. For me, I'd like to, you remember, like the war movies when they have to do the nuclear codes and they have to break the little plastic box.
Keys. Oh yeah.
Yeah. I want that. I want someone to have to take like a little plastic box out of the safe and crack it, and then there'll be my master thing on there.
Right.
I just got to figure out how to make one of those things.
Yeah, and I even have a safe, and like the safe's attached to the house, so you cannot pick it up, or it'd be very difficult to pick it up and run with it. So like that's good. But I even feel weird about putting plain text password to my password keeper in the safe. And then, this also talks about, like, if I have KeyPass X, there is apparently when you change the master password, you have the option to print off instructions. And then it won't have the master password on it, but you can write it on there and then give that to someone or put it in the safe or whatever. But even with that, do you think someone could like turn on my computer that runs Linux? They would need my password to get to open it and then find that program. It's not like I have an icon on my desktop that says Mike's passwords.
What is a desktop? I'm not familiar.
I don't know. There's a lot of things you look at. It's like, it would be easier if the people taking care of your affairs after your passing had access to this stuff. And it's probably something worth thinking about. Another rocket, Tom.
Oh, it's 2 rockets. So 3 rockets.
3.
Too many rockets.
The third rocket.
My pick this week was from Lewin Day. Japanese rocket engine explodes continuously and on purpose. And I want to say how fantastic of a title that is. I may be a little bit jealous of that. But it's
I wonder whose title that is, because I'm not sure whether that was an editorial title or a Lewin title. But
all right. We got to see who we can give credit to for that.
Yeah, I might have to go look at the revisions, but I just, it's a breathtaking title. Right?
And it is perfect, because that is exactly what happens in this engine. I think there's kind of an assumption that, in a traditional rocket engine, it's sort of described as like a directed explosion, right? But that's not really the case. There's actually nothing exploding inside of a rocket engine. It's just burning very fast and very, violently. But in this engine, it is literally an explosion. And the hypersonic shockwave created by that explosion sets off another explosion. And if you get everything just right, you have a self-sustaining reaction. And the upside, again, this is all pretty theoretical, is that if you can really harness this technology, you can see huge efficiency increases on the order of maybe 20-30%, which is a huge. I mean, if somebody told you your car would get 30% better fuel mileage, you'd be like, oh, that's awesome. But like for a rocket, that's that's game changing. I mean, traditional rocket design, they're chasing 2% gains. So if you can actually get a 30% gain, you're talking about unlocking missions which may have been impossible before, doing them cheaper, faster. It would be huge. The downside is that, at least so far in the ones that have been demonstrated, this is the Japanese one that this article is about. There was another one University of Central Florida did last year, or 2020. They're fairly low thrust. On the order of under 1,000 newtons, which is 200 200-ish pounds of thrust. So you're not going to get off the ground with this. You'd need to have a rocket that weighed 200 pounds. But this is something that you would use in space. And it kind of is a middle ground between, traditional rocket engines, which have a lot of power, but aren't especially fuel efficient, and something like an ion engine, which is ridiculously fuel efficient, but has minuscule thrust that, it's like a breeze on your hand. This kind of falls in between there. And in this case, the Japanese experiment was using it for the upper stage of a rocket, which is something you would really never be able to do with an ion thruster. It's way too low. But you could also use it to, once you get into orbit, you could send a vehicle to the moon, Mars, at some kind of deep space locale. So it's very exciting for not necessarily the sort of things we're doing in low Earth orbit with the space station, but pushing out farther, especially with this renewed interest in going to the moon, and anything that could help us get more payload to the moon with less fuel is also very interesting right now.
So I did look it up, Tom, and this is right out of Elliot's mind, this title. So bravo, Elliot. He must have jumped up and clicked his heels together when he came up with that one, because it's very good. That does not diminish the quality of the article, because Lewin has done a great job of writing through this. And one of the things I thought was interesting is that the Japanese test, it wasn't the main rocket engine. It was actually the second stage engine. On this. So when they show the rocket launch, the rocket goes up, and then there's the second stage that starts with this. I think that the concept is really cool. So you basically have a cylinder within a cylinder, and that cavity between the two cylinders is where the explosions are happening, and they're happening angled, coming out of nozzles kind of on the base of the cylinder. And I would really love to see ultra high speed video of one of these starting to light, because I think it creates a shockwave. And so you should be able to see like these angled cones of power starting to develop inside of the nozzle of this rocket.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I was looking more into this after I read this, and apparently there is a certain amount of difficulty in figuring out if you've successfully establish the rotating detonation thing, because I guess even when it doesn't work, it's still going to be a rocket engine. It's just not going to be a detonation rocket engine. So they were talking about different techniques of like injecting a dye into the propellants and then using high speed footage to watch the dye move. Right. And then when that's how they could see that like hypersonic field being generated. Otherwise, it's all just a big ball of fire, and it's kind of hard to quantify. So that's a whole other field of research, is how do you look inside there and determine, are you really getting this the self-sustaining reaction that you're looking for? And it's hard. Yeah. I mean, there's a reason that they've only done 2 of these things so far. Yeah. This is one of those technologies that 20 years ago, they would have been like, oh, it's impossible. It's impossible. It's just, It's not, we're not going to do it. They're similar to, I wrote an article a while ago about the engine that SpaceX developed for Starship. Like, there was a time that they just said, no, like, you can't do that. It's too hard. But, with modern technology and, the computational simulations we can do now, a lot of these things that were believed to be just beyond our technology, it turns out you can do. It's still hard, but you can do it if you're dedicated and you got the funding.
That's all the time we have for this episode of the Hackaday podcast. As always, we'd love to hear from you. You can leave a comment on the show notes, which you'll find at hackaday.com/podcast. You can email us, editor@hackaday.com. We live and die by the tips that you send us, so if you've done something cool or you see something cool, please tell us about it. tips@hackaday.com. And until next time,
keep on hacking.
Actually, if you could say a few more goofy things, I don't know if we have enough outtakes yet.
Oh yeah, depth. See, it's wordplay.
It's the TikToks, yo.
I suppose that is accurate. Yeah. I'm gonna go sit in the corner real quick.